You're listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Now, it is time to break it down.
Welcome to episode 66 of the Sonny Brown Breakdown. I'm your host, Sonny Brown, and in this episode, I speak to Andy from School of Grappling and Greg Souders from Standard Jujitsu. So I was lucky enough to be able to bring these guys together and host a discussion representing both of their methodologies on how they teach grappling. They get in depth, of course, into the theory at the start, get into the practicalities. Very interesting discussion, and I really hope you guys enjoy it. It was an honor to be able to host these two. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast, check out sunnybrown.net. Follow me on Instagram, which is @sunnybrownbreakdown. And without further ado, let's go to the podcast. G'day, guys. I'm here today with Greg Souders and Andy from School of Grappling. We're going to have a discussion on the ecological approach, and in particular, Andy might have some criticisms or some alternatives that he'd like to put forward. So I'll start things off with Greg. How are you doing today, mate?
I'm doing good, sir, man. Good as always.
Excellent, mate. Great to have you back. You've been pushing ecological approach far and wide and have now become known as the go-to guy in the jiu-jitsu space for better or worse. It rests on your shoulders now.
It changes from better to worse and worse to better, so it goes back and forth. But either way, I'm happy to have some effect.
And Andy, you have been busy on the PhD front and popping up occasionally on Instagram again. How are you doing today, mate?
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I mean, we talked last week, so I'm stoked to talk to you again. And also, I'm very happy to talk to Greg because we wanted to talk about together for a long time now, I think. But I always felt like the first time we would talk maybe would be very educational for other people, maybe just interesting for other people. So I kind of on purpose pushed it further away and away to make some arrangements so we can actually do a podcast. Because I think like it's maybe a different perspective if we would have never talked. And yeah, let's see.
Okay, so to start things off, I'll open the floor to Andy in debate-style moderation. Andy, I know you are, of course, aware of the ecological approach that Greg has been pushing, but there are some differences that you put forward, and I guess if we want to start off with where your current understanding of that sits and the questions you'd like to put to Greg.
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, I hope it's not really a debate because I'm not sure if we're really that different in our point of view. It's more like let's say it like this. I'm aware of the whole idea of ecological psychology or the constraints-led approach for at least like 3 to 4 years. I first came across it when I was watching some YouTube videos of a guy called, I think, Ben Galloway. And he was doing these like 5 to 10 minute clips on what we now call ecological dynamics. And he often put it in the context of soccer. I think Ben was an Australian guy. And that's when I came across it. And immediately I were like, yeah, of course, this stuff works. I was already familiar with system theory, a little bit with ecological psychology, but not that much. And it immediately resonated with me. And ever since, I've been using the constraints-led approach a lot. I think it's one of the things I do as a coach, and I think it's probably the thing I do most, maybe. So it's not really that I'm against it in any way. It's not that I'm arguing that there's necessarily something better, because I'm not even sure what better or worse in this context means. All I'm saying, or what my perspective on the matter is, I always came from this more like overall tinkering, systems theory, and for me, very important phenomenological perspective. And this is kind of the framework I'm using to make sense of agency, learning, coaching, whatever. And I always felt that, you can explain a lot with ecological dynamics, but not everything. So I will give a clear example. For me, I always realized that I learn a lot by observing others. And I don't mean by watching YouTube clips where somebody is demonstrating a technique or something, where he's breaking it down. I don't mean that. I mean, I watch competition footage, and I don't know, I was on a binge of, let's say, Zidakov or something. And then I would realize that when I was practicing, engaging in sparring, I would literally sense the world a little bit differently, and I would have embodied kind of what I have seen. And this was something that was always had a huge impression on me. Another thing is, I always felt that if I understand some concepts, especially like mechanical concepts, better, that this would in turn inform my practice. Let's say, even if it's a constraint/drill or whatever, that if I had a better understanding of the concepts and if I would have studied them, I would have a better decision making in the moment. And another thing that I always found very interesting was this idea of a sudden insight or aha moment. Because I can say for sure that I have been doing some things for maybe months or years, and I would have some success. And then somebody showed me, or I saw it in an instruction or whatever, and it immediately made sense to me that this is better. Sometimes even without practicing, because there was a kind of shift on perspective, and then I would see it, I would try it, and it would immediately make a big jump in my performance. And these are just some examples where I'm not even saying that they cannot be explained with ecological dynamics. Maybe they can, but it's not really that they're like really talked about or in the focus. So I would be curious what Greg has to say about these ideas or things.
Yeah, for sure. I think that part of the reason that you don't hear a lot of these concepts come up, especially not in the current discussion in the jiu-jitsu sphere, is that there's not enough people who know enough about the science itself to get into that level of discussion. So when we're talking about, cultural constraints, social constraints, the constraints on perception based on previous experience, no one is getting this deep to discuss it. Even these small charges seem to be kind of confusing to me, because watching another person and feeling inspiration from them and picking up information from watching a live match is something that's explained by ecological dynamics and ecological psychology. Just as a small thing, I think I've spoke about this before, like we even pick up the affordances of others when we watch them do it. They've studied it. So when watching one person perform a behavior, and then if the watcher is asked, is that object reachable? Are they at the correct distance to perform this action? Even the watcher can see what, at some level of perception, what the person doing the action is experiencing and what information they might be picking up to organize their behavior. So mimicry, copying, using your eyes to see what other people are doing, to me, are part of the whole view of an organism interacting with their environment, because their environment is not just the objective reality outside of them, like the physical structure of the world. It's also the other people. It's the culture in which they exist. It's their previous experiences. These are all different forms of the environment. So the reason I feel that you have inspiration in those moments is because it correlates with our human experience or the human environment, which is clearly defined and explained by ecological dynamics.
Yeah, okay, maybe that's a good point then, because I resonate with pretty much everything you said. But from the feeling I get, and I talked to it with Sonny at some point, if I Google ecological dynamics, actually there isn't that much information of some theory. It's like it doesn't even have a Wikipedia page really. So in my head, what I meant when people talk ecological dynamics, first of all, I'm a bit confused because I never saw a real definition what it is. So what I assumed is it's ecological psychology plus systems theory or nonlinear dynamics. And correct. If this is like the definition, then I don't really see where you talked about experience, where this idea of subjective experience, which in my view is very phenomenological perspective, where this comes from. Because from my point of view, if you just combine ecological psychology and nonlinear dynamics, it's not really that you have entered even the idea of consciousness, attention, intentionality, because these are more or less very intrinsic phenomenological ideas. And then you kind of slowly end up at embodied cognitive science, with the most extreme case would be enactivism.
Yep.
And I'm very aware that there's a huge overlap between ecological psychology and enactivism. But I always, how I read it in the literature, is that the big difference between enactivism and ecological psychology is exactly that phenomenological dimension. And if you would say that this is included, then I would agree with everything you said, but then I'd also understand why it's ecological dynamics and not, enactivism then.
Yeah, so I think the confusion here is just kind of the history of how it emerged and who defined their terms as being what part of what science. So I think the thing is this whole movement towards embodied cognition, so to speak, which the ecological approach is part of, is just someone's idea of at what level things are operating. You have certain people who are discussing the brain as being inactive, some as being active, some as like cognition is not present, it is present. There's a bunch of different things, but they're all under the same umbrella. So I think the confusion is really in the definition of what the field is called. So Rob Gray talked about this in his podcast. They're agreeing that ecological psychology is sort of the realm that we're all operating in. And of course, because some theoretical framework from nonlinear dynamics is coming in, we're also calling it ecological dynamics, but nobody's really hard set and agreed upon how we're going to call this thing. So I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes when you get on the internet and start searching it up. Because again, some people take a hard stance, like this is the science I represent, and other people do not. And so I think it's just all over the place. I think there is no cohesive point where they're all meeting. Like, for example, Wagman and Blau put out the first book, Introduction to Ecological Psychology, only a few years ago. So even the introductory text has just been written. So it's so new, and I don't think it's fully defined. And I'm going to say one more thing, and I'll stop talking. You don't like to talk this long in one stream. I think J.J. Gibson sort of did a disservice when he started talking about direct perception. He did not add in the human environment, what we would call culture, what we would call previous experience, what we would call he didn't bring any of that in. He did not explain how affected behavior, so to speak. So he left a lot of holes, and so a lot of the new thinkers are trying to fill those gaps that Gibson left behind in his explanation of perception.
Yeah, okay. So maybe before we can move to more like practical things, like how maybe we approach training differently. That's kind of my criticism, what you said, that there is not really a definition. And from my perspective, so I came first and foremost from Merleau-Ponty. It's a phenomenological philosopher.
I know
who in my, but maybe not the listener, who, in my point of view, was like the first guy who really, really, really focused on this whole idea of embodied cognition, that there's this kind of idea which we all talk about, this action-perception coupling or sensory-motor loops, however you want to spin it. And I see that this is like the big originator, and that from there, all the gaps you have talked about in ecological psychology, I felt like they are already filled in cognitive science, in enactivism or many ideas. So for me personally, just don't feel the need of calling these ideas ecological psychology, because like you said, from my perspective, Gibson was talking about affordances but years after Merleau talked about ideas like motor intentionality or the body schema. So I don't really see why I would, this might sound harsh, give Gibson the credit for this whole embodied cognition framework, let's say. And the other thing is, like I said, is there are like frameworks who have already integrated these attentional, subjective, experiential, or affective dimensions to the framework. Let's say enactivism, for example. I'm not saying I'm an activist. I'm just saying as an example. And that's why I'm like seeing that we probably agree on most premises, but I'm just not on board on calling what I believe is ecological psychology, to be honest. But that's just...
I was talking to Sonny about this earlier. I think that, I think that's one of the issues. Like anytime I hear you speak, I feel like we call this term like a fence rider. You stay in the middle to be safe, and I don't do that. what I decide to do is I take an idea, I try to learn as much about the idea as I can, and I implement it wholeheartedly to try to determine its limits. I feel like there's no way to truly understand something unless you commit yourself to the process. We can commit ourselves to a process and not believe in it dogmatically, but we can act as if we believed in it dogmatically. And this is sort of my approach. And the idea that I like to talk about Gibson so much for is his idea of direct perception, which I think, even though in his definition is not fully fleshed out, I feel like he delivered his understanding in a way that kind of overrode everyone else's. Everyone else's, it felt kind of mushy and squishy, where his felt just solid. And you could add your own personal understanding to it to push it forward. And so that's why I give him credit for the inspiration that I feel. It's like there's a line I bring up that he says all the time. He said, because he's the one who came up with the idea of affordances, right? The specifying information that we pick up in the environment that we adhere to, that causes the emergence of behavior. He said affordances are both objective and subjective, but also neither. And for me, this was easy to understand. This is the phenomenological experience that we're all having, where we're acting out upon the information in the world, but it's out there, but it's also not out there. It's in us, but it's also not in us. It's relational. It's this thing that's constantly in flux, and we can't really parse it out. So it's almost impossible to define. And I appreciate that he said that, because it gives us a lot of room as coaches. And so it really kind of only sticks us in one place. We just have to make sure that the athlete is always in the environment, because that's where all the information is. And we can take the time to parse out what we mean by environment, but either way, we're in it and we can't be removed from it. And so again, that's his ideas. That's why they're important to me, because they stick people in the world.
Yeah, and I agree. That's also where I give Gibson the credit, that he really hammered home this idea of affordances, which I think was really important at the time. But all I'm saying is but the whole idea was already discussed. The problem was that the people before him, even William James or Merleau-Ponty, they didn't really give it a specific name or concept, and so it was hard for people to really get it, talk about it, whatever. So that's really
correct.
How where I see his big accomplishment is. Where I disagree, or maybe not disagree, where I see there's a different perspective. In the end, you talked about the environment and then about the world. And this is where I kind of see maybe the difference of perspective. I think we're talking mostly about the same stuff, but what I mean is I don't really think I'm middle ground, because I'm deeply in the phenomenological tradition. I'm saying, like you said, for me, experience is always the first thing I care about. I think in order to learn, we have to think about the experiences we have, other people have, or students have, and whatever. And this means I'm like you said, I'm inhabiting a world. And this is for me, the big difference. If you're coming from ecological psychology, there's always talk of the environment. And from the phenomenological side, it's always the talk about the world. And it comes back to Heidegger and to Husserl about the life world and being in the world. And I think there are obviously big overlap of these ideas, but I feel like there's also differences. And I focus more on, like I said, on the idea you kind of hinted at, that the world we inhabit subjectively as it is experienced, the lived world, is, like you said, co-constructed. It's not out there and we just perceive it and quick information out of it, but we our own mode of being already kind of has this looping relationship to the world, basically, like you said. But that's exactly kind of my criticism. That's not usually how the environment is talked about in ecological psychology or dynamics. It's usually we have the environment, and then we put the student in the environment, and then the environment offers the student affordances, and then somehow the student picks up these affordances and acts. And this is where I say, from the more an activist perspective, it's more no, there is not the environment. It's the student inhabits a world, a certain perspective on the environment, and he is constantly coupled and co-creating. And I think this is a distinction that I think is important, and I feel like you would agree, but I think It's not how most people talk about environmental constraints and stuff.
I agree. I actually agree with you. And then, but it's funny. It's I guess the reason I've kind of ignored that is one, because again, I'm not talking with anyone that we can get to this level of discussion with. So most people are like, but did you try it in jiu-jitsu? But did they study it in jiu-jitsu? Like nobody thinks beyond the 5th grade level. So I don't even know how to bring this stuff up. But also at the same time, when I read this work, to me, it's already assumed. So when I read the word environment, again, maybe this is, again, my perspective as Greg, the human, who in all my previous experiences, I'm not bothered by Gibson's seemingly solely objective viewpoint. You know what I mean? When I read him, when I hear the environment, I hear everything, the world we live in, the human world, the culture, everything. It's affecting us at all times. And so I guess that's why I don't bring it up. You know what I mean? Like when I look at an athlete, it's not just the physics of their bodies interacting. It's who they are, why they're here, their emotions as they change from day to day, their motivations, the things that make them happy, that make them sad. These all affect what's happening every time they interact. And so, you know, I guess I've always took it as for granted, because that's how I see when I hear environment. That's what I see. Because I believe in this stuff holistically. I don't think this stuff can be parsed out. And I think sometimes that's why discussing is rather difficult. We have to have that agreed upon experience, and then we have to come up with the words to best describe it. And oftentimes we get lost in jargon, and we don't really do reality justice with our words. So anyway, yeah. So I'm in agreement, I guess.
And that's where I maybe say this jokingly, but maybe not so much, is then I would call you an activist and not really an ecological psychology guy. Well, that's my perspective, right? So because I think we agree on this, and what I wanted to say is, this is my criticism again, is you said it's implicit how you read it, but the point is, in other frameworks like in activism, it's not implicit, it's explicitly stated that all these ideas are like fundamental. It's like the whole notion of sense making is like fundamental to these ideas, and care structures like emotions. It's all like people in the activist tradition make really sure that the reader, or like this, whoever is engaged with in activism, really understands that all these ideas are crucial, extremely crucial to understanding agency or behavior in any level. And I think this is what I mean, is if you come from this implicitly because it's your understanding, I would argue that we probably have a very similar perspective. But I'm just saying, but I would argue you will not find it explicitly in ecological psychology.
And I agree. But like I said, I agree. Like, so when I had to read some sort of tertiary text to understand this. So most recent, I guess, last couple of months was with Hagen's book, Effective Gibsonian Psychology, where he tried to fill the gaps using sort of this active inference idea as a way to kind of, get the human experience into the model of direct perception. But again, I think it's funny, and I appreciate the exercise in clarity, because I know that's the business of science and philosophers, is to try to be as clear as possible. But at the same time, it felt redundant, and just in my mind, because I feel like, how does a human read about something and then separate the ideas from the human world? I don't know how people do that. I can't do that.
Yes, sadly, that's how most people do it. I would agree with you. It's sad, but I think it's sadly the way the modern world kind of has shaped to be, that people have this pseudo-scientific view of the world where they think everything is only true if it's objectively stated. And I think this is also where a lot of the confusions come from, where we discuss these ideas. So I would agree with you, but I would also say that sadly that's how most people probably talk about, most people you talk with about these ideas have these kind of scientific perspective. And I think that's maybe also where you kind of get very in frustrating discussions with people, because they don't have this more subjective experiential dimension.
Or any experience. They're just, running from their emotions, shooting off about things they don't understand. And that's really been my deepest frustration, is that, I'm just a layman talking to other laymen about interesting ideas, but nobody else is putting in even the smallest amount of work. And so, if all this literature is out there and we're trying to understand the nature of perception, the nature of action, the nature of coaching, how our words affect each other, how being around each other and creating these environments and cultures affect each other, if we're not in the business to understand this, then what the hell are we in the business of, And so that's really been the frustrating point for me is, even though this is an amateur sport and I'm just a small school somewhere in the middle of nowhere, I take my job very seriously because I realize what I'm actually trying to accomplish. I'm not teaching jiu-jitsu. I'm teaching human behavior. And so I should understand that as deeply as I can at some fundamental level based on the literature that's available to try to understand it. So again, it's the laziness.
I absolutely agree. I mean, this was the whole reason why I started my Instagram page at the first place, right? So I had the same perspective that I saw that people were just like basically showing the movement and were calling it something, maybe even in Japanese terms for whatever reason. And then they would say their students, oh yeah, now repeat it 100 times left, 100 times right. And for me, it was obvious that's not how, like you said, we perceive, act, and learn in the world. And I guess we are on the same mission, just from maybe slightly different perspective.
Well, my initial perspective was to get people just to change the way they practice. This, for some reason, people have this, they detest live work. And I know why, because it's hard and it's difficult. And especially if you're coming in off the street, if you're just a pedestrian walking into a room, getting on top of a sweaty body and holding them down for 6 minutes seems like a particularly aggressive activity. And so people a lot of times culturally want to skirt this by offering a soft view of what is actually happening, which in some instances I think is completely fine. But if it's the center of our culture and we're expecting to understand the nature of a fight from the soft center, I think we miss it. I think we end up doing what the whole enterprise was trying to defeat. We turn the jiu-jitsu experience into, strip mall karate. And I'm trying to separate from that by updating the coaching practices and letting fighters be fighters and letting competitors be competitors, and knowing that there's a thing here that we need. There's an environment that we're missing that we need to engage in to truly develop skill, and it has to be associated with exactly what we're doing, which is fighting at some level, right? Grappling tactics, of course, but fighting nonetheless. And so our coaching practice should be up to date and in line with that.
Yeah, I think that's where we agree. I think we both agree on, I would say, like, if I would say what are the three things we 100% agree on, and I think it's probably the most important things, is that the experience of the student is absolutely primary and essential.
Essential.
Then that two, everything is contextual. That depending on how you do it, where you do it, everything is contextual. And that we both have this idea of, let's say, embodied cognition, action, perception, couplings, self-organizational behavior, call it whatever you like, right? And maybe I'm really honest. I on purpose didn't really watch a lot of your clips and things, because I was like curious what kind of questions I would ask, because I think many people would have the same questions, right? So I would have, if I would have come here for a debate and the goal was, maybe I can get this Greg Souders to say something stupid, maybe then I would have watched all your videos and podcasts, whatever. But I was like, I had a rough idea what you're about, and now I just wanted to ask you a few questions, because I feel like it's for me important question, and maybe other people also have them, right? I could have researched in advance, but I did on purpose. So, for example,
yeah,
do you show any techniques at all, and do you do any explanations, or is it just all experiential constraints, like whatever?
So the way that I would talk about this would be, first, no, I don't show any explicit techniques outside of what we would call modeling behaviors. So the idea would be something like this. If I'm working with a new person and I want to define something for them, like the guard, of course you start off with the definition so they know what we're looking at. So I would start with something simple, something very human. A guard is any situation where a bottom player has their legs in front of a top player. The guard takes many orientations and has many aesthetics, but its function is central. We use our guard to make and maintain connection and manage distance. And then I am literally in the position, putting my feet on somebody in front of me as I'm explaining this. This is what we do. Now, in this game, we're going to learn how to develop our guard by focusing on making these connections. Your job as the bottom player is to do X, Y, and Z. Top player, your job is to do X, Y, and Z. And I'm in the position showing this as I'm speaking. So the students are looking in at what I'm showing, so they have a visual image of what I'm defining, and then I'm giving them tasks to perform as they now going to go into this defined and seen position, and they're going to experience it for themselves. So to me, it's all part of this, the central thing, but I'm not showing them anything outside of what they need to know to start having their first experience. And then everything grows from that. So in the traditional sense, no, I don't show moves at all, but I model behaviors in such a way they have a visual understanding of what's expected of them based on how we define the situations we put them in. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, sure. So I'm curious, when you show for, let's say, a drill or constraint lab. So just for clarification, if you do a drill with a constraint-led approach, how do you call it? Is it a game or what? Is it a drill? Just so we don't get confused.
Well, no, you can use either. I don't use either of those languages. I'll be like, in this situation, I would say something like this. In this situation, our focus is to, or our objective is to. That's exactly how I speak. I don't say, in this drill, I don't use the word game or drill. That's something that other people in the community use. I just say, in this situation, this is our focus. This is what we're trying to accomplish.
Okay, and then the question is, if you do this, do you kind of explain, like you said, where you maintain the distance, make connections and stuff? Do you go like more, also maybe not always, but sometimes into explanations of, let's say, mechanics, this might accomplish X because of, I don't know, it's a frame or whatever? Or do you really try to get on with it real quick so people can engage in the practice?
Well, the short answer is I try to get on with it as quick as I can so people engage. With about 90 seconds of speaking, people are already picking at their toes, ready to move on. We understand we're dealing with an adult population who most of the time is just getting off of work to get here. So their bandwidth for, perceptive acuity is that of a 5-year-old child. So, trying to get them to focus on doing something that so they can start the learning process is really my goal. So I try to keep my explanations to only what's necessary. Again, I use a simple metric. So I define the situation we're in by explaining what it is and what its function is, and I am physically in it, so they have a visual model of what their expectation is. The second thing I give them is the task. This is the thing they're going to be trying to accomplish while in the situation that I just defined. And the third is the objective. This is the thing that ends the game or keeps the game continuous. And that's all explained to the student when they're starting their first situation. So there is explanation, but again, it's just enough to get started, and I don't ever talk more than 2 minutes at a time. Anywhere between 90 seconds would be my shortest, 3 minutes would be my longest, and I should be able to fit everything into that.
Okay, so maybe I can tell you how maybe I do things differently. So that might be interesting. So for example, I have this. I would say I use pretty much everything. I do show techniques occasionally. I explain stuff. Sometimes I even talk a bit longer than I probably should. And the point is, where I would agree with you, that especially for beginners, I don't really show technique, right? So if somebody comes, like you said, off the street, I throw them into the fire. I let them engage in constraints-led situations, or in positional sparring, or even live rolling. I just make sure that they roll with the right people, right, so they don't get hurt. So I would agree that if the person I'm coaching has no experience whatsoever, then I don't use any explanations of anything. I don't use any concepts. I don't use any techniques. I let them first get a baseline, get an experience, right, so they know what this all is about from an intuitive and embodied sense.
Yep.
And where I kind of disagree with you, or maybe not disagree, it's just how I do it, is when somebody is having a specific problem, and more often than not, they actually come to me with a question, right?
Yep,
they're saying, "Oh, how can I do this or that?" Then I'm more than comfortable than explaining that. And I sit them and say, "Look, you have this problem," and I explain them in depth why they have this problem. And then I show them how I think they should do better. And then usually what will happen is they will try, mainly without resistance. We could call it drilling, 3 or 4 times. And then quickly I tell them, okay, now increase again the resistance, try to get it to work. And then even if it doesn't work right away, now they have still a new perspective. And I think the most important part is, and I think this is where what you criticized is, but now the explanation, everything is relevant to them. And they have a sense where they know why it's relevant to them. If you have a group of students and you just show everything the same move and say, yeah, do this because I show you, then nobody can, like you said, concentrate for more than 60 seconds because they don't see the relevancy. And I'm always trying to make sure that I can point out why something is relevant for people, or I can just catch people when I see now I can insert relevant information to them, to this person right now. And this is why I'm not shying away from showing explicitly certain move or technique.
Well, I think, if you don't mind, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think the issue with what I think you just explained is I think you make a large assumption when you say something like, I explain the thing they need. I'm not that confident as a coach that I have that answer. So what I try to first do when a student comes to me with a question, because that's where my explicit process starts, is I urge them to define the problem before we talk any further. So if a student comes to me and they say, hey, coach, I'm having a difficult time with this idea, the first thing I try to get them to try to notice about them is what was their intention. So I ask them a question rather than give them an answer. What were you trying to accomplish? If they can't clearly define what they were trying to accomplish, I would set them back out again. Like, once you can come to me and tell me what you were trying to do, then we can start a discussion. Because if learning is self-directed and it's based on someone's own perception and they have to take their perception and link it to some action, it must be personal. So if I just filled their mind with different things that I thought were right, I never got a chance to listen to what they thought they were having a problem with. So I need to first start there, and not with me, with them, because you said the athlete's the most important thing. So if I can't get the athlete recognizing and defining the problem they have, what am I really doing? So after they can define the problem, I ask them another question. What did you try to do about it? As you recognize that this was a problem, how did you try to solve the situation? What were you trying to do? Where were you trying to go? Again, if they can't define that, I'll set them out again. Go try again. If they can then define their problem and tell me what they tried to do about it and they were still stuck, that's when my experience, I think, becomes the most necessary, if I'm going to give them explicit instruction. But it's only at the point of their understanding, not mine. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep speaking so much, but I'll say one more thing. And I never have them do anything slowly or statically, because the thing is that's a solution to nothing. My movements are contextually relevant. We don't move in a vacuum. Our movements only make sense in which the context we use them. The problem is never, can I move against a static opponent? Because you could drill it a few times, but as soon as you go out there and try it live, it's going to fail, probably even worse than when you try to drill it. So to me, I think that just bloats the system and it isn't necessary for learning. So
yeah, and that's where I would say everything is contextual. I think how you go about things, I think in some context, maybe in many, and for some people, I think it's exactly the right way to do it. But I give you also a concrete example, okay? So let's say somebody is trying to do leg locks or something, trying to get heel hooks, and then maybe he comes to me and says, dude, they always turn around, turn their legs, and then they kick out and whatever. And I'm then saying, well, I tell you what you could do to solve this problem is, we talked about rotation, because usually I also talk a lot about mechanics and stuff. And I tell them, well, if you want to stop rotation, you have to see where the axis is and how to maybe control the lever and whatever. And then I tell them, try this, control the toes. If you just have the toes on 90 degrees, you have broken the axis and they just they cannot turn, right? So I show them, they try to turn, and it's for me, this is what I mean with aha moment or insight. And they just realize, well, yeah, obviously, if I have the toes 90 degrees to the shin and I have the toes fixed, there's no way a person can turn. It's just biomechanics, right? And for me, this is why many people I show, and they just do it. They don't have to drill it. They don't have to engage in kind of situation again. Is once they have understood, they will do it, and they can do it instantly, and it will make their behavior in this instant, in this situation, better. So I'm not sure why I have to the need in every context. I'm not saying there is a lot of context where this might be good, but I don't see the need why in every context I have to tell them, yeah, try again, come back when you have the problem. And it's sometimes I think that's worthwhile, and sometimes I think you can give a quick cue and make a big difference because you can produce an insight because it's relevant to the person right now.
Right. I agree, but I think you're using a highly specific example. And so the way I like to think about it is, what's the long-term effect on the student? What type of student am I trying to create? Am I trying to create a resilient, robust thinker who digs into the problem deeply to try to find things for themselves so it sticks with them longer, so they become more adaptable and flexible in the face of variation and novelty? Or am I just trying to get an outcome? If I'm trying to just get a mechanical outcome, of course, here, hold the toes, stay attached to the outside of the knee and stay attached to the hip. It's going to reduce the ability for your partner to rotate. Fantastic. But they didn't search. So again, for me, it's where is that value? Do I need them to know this today, right now? Are they just asking to soothe that intellectual curiosity? Is this going to affect future learning? If I tell them this, will they ignore the problem and just copy what I just showed them? What new context am I creating for the student by giving them what they're asking for? So I ask myself 1,000 questions before I just jump and say, okay, this is it. Because like I said, I don't parse things out. I think that everything's interacting at all time. Constraints cause coherence. My information is a constraint. My previous experience is a constraint. The things I say to my students are a constraint. So what am I constraining them to? So again, I have to know the outcome of what I'm doing with my words before I feel so free to tell anybody anything.
Yeah, see, and this is where I kind of agree and also kind of disagree. I mean, yes, I also want flexible, adaptable people, and I also tell them I want them to think and search for themselves. And this is where I kind of say that, but this searching for problem solution, which is crucial, which I would agree, doesn't always have to be only trial and error, because I think, like, if you look at how most animals learn, many animals actually just observe others. They watch, they try to imitate, they're just like this. Like you said, I don't think that it's so bad to talk to people about stuff, to ask for information. So yeah, but that's what I mean. It's like the social context. It's also a skill to talk with your teammates, right? It's also a skill to know which person to maybe ask a few questions to drill with. And I think I agree that the autonomy of the students is very important. And I think it's very important that they have this tinkering mindset where they're trying to figure it out for themselves, and I don't give them all the answers. But I think that it's more like an ongoing loop of many things you could do. You could try, engage in practice. You could observe. You could ask people, you could try to understand. And I think it's where I see it as a good practice is where the students kind of can put all these together in a way where it's not disconnected, where it's just not looking for simple explanations and then, oh yeah, that's it. No. He has to engage again in trial and error and create these experiences and get into it. But also it's not, for me personally, I see no issue if he just observes others, looks, talks about it, asks. I think it's I'm a bit more open to maybe, let's say, other pathways than just trying, because I think also observing others is an experience, right? It's not like something abstract.
Yeah, I think you might be misunderstanding me. Again, I am in no way suggesting that those aren't component parts of the greater whole, and that they're all part of the human experience, the human environment, the interaction. I think they're critical. What I'm commenting on is my role as a coach. So my role as the coach is to create a robust and information-rich environment where all those things are possible. Like, I don't bother my students when they're out there, doing their games and situations and drills and whatever, and they're just babbling at each other and talking and showing each other wrong shit and I don't stop it. I let it all happen because it's all healthy. It's all part of exploration and doing things. But again, the things I say and the way I design practice are based on a theoretical framework that I try to stay true to as much as I need to. But again, I don't let my adherence, dissuade my pragmatics. If there's some way that I can make a student a better learner or solve a problem they're facing, I will 100% do that. But again, I have to ask myself the question, to what behest am I going to be doing this? What is going to be the outcome of this interaction? And I have to consider that. One thing that hasn't come up that I think is interesting, and I think you would want to talk about, is the way that authority is perceived in a room. So one of the things we fail to understand as coaches is when students look at us sometimes like we're these superheroes with all this information, and we have all the secret scrolls and everything we say is right. So I'm very cautious about solving people's problems for them, because sometimes that causes the environment to be overly constrained, where their student wants to replicate what they saw coach do or what they saw coach say. And so I try to avoid that, authoritative interaction as much as possible. And I try to give the power back to them. Be critical, think for yourself, try again. But it doesn't mean we're not talking. It doesn't mean we're not interacting. It doesn't mean we're not watching others. It doesn't mean that we're not watching video, because all that's happening. But again, I'm just controlling the room as much as I can.
Yeah, see, that's where I kind of agree. I also am very anti-authoritarian in my approach. And but that's what I mean is I also think of it kind of like you. I try to create an environment, or maybe I think it's better to think of it like a culture in the room, where I'm not shying away to give people cues, but also I'm always making sure that I frame it in a way where I'm saying it's a suggestion which they can try, and I also always leave them, like you said, alone if they are trying to figure it out for themselves, or maybe even someone shows them something wrong. Because exactly, this is where I agree. I believe that just how I can give tips and cues, everybody can give tips and cues. I don't want them to think that I'm the guy who knows the stuff. I can give the cues and everybody else is not allowed. I'm saying, like, if you roll with somebody or engage in something and you realize, oh, I think I could help the person if I would give them my perspective, let's say, then I think there's nothing wrong with it, even if it's like, oh, try to hold this toe like this and try. I'm not maybe just that much shying away from, I don't know, giving more cues and verbal stuff. I feel like from let's say more like a theoretical perspective, I would say we would agree on most things. So I think more the implementation is probably where we differ most.
Well, I think only in one factor. I just think that explicit instruction is not as powerful as people make it out to be. We have to make a lot of assumptions about the strength of our words as they inspire others. And sometimes we do it well, sometimes we do it poorly, but I think it's in flux like every other experience. I think, when we talk about environments, or at least when I do, I'm not talking about just the objective out there. I'm also talking about the subjective in there, the human environment, everything about what's going on. So I don't know. I think we only disagree on the...
Maybe then I have, when you say this is the disagreement, then I think I have something we can talk about, because this makes my hair stand up, I tell you. So I've heard you say there is no double leg.
Yes.
What do you mean?
Okay, so all takedowns, every single one you've ever seen, require the feet to come off the mat. And so when we say double leg, oftentimes we're only defining the mechanical alignment of grabbing two legs in a very specific way. So what I mean to say is nothing makes sense outside of its function or its effect. So taking two legs off the ground is the same by any other name. And so we first have to get at that origin problem before we can get at the mechanics problem. Because to me, a hip throw and a double leg are functionally the same.
See, and that's where I disagree. Because I think they're not.
Disagree with that. A double leg.
Because the mechanics are different.
But
one is a tackle, one is a twisting throw. It's like the way you shift the center of gravity is completely different. The forces you use, I agree that form follows function. Yes, of course. But what I'm saying is that the way you apply force is completely different.
Right.
So why would you call it the same?
I wouldn't call it the same. What I'm trying to point out is that the outcome is what we're after. So if we were teaching a hip throw, for example, we're teaching a very specific alignment that takes both feet off the ground. If we're teaching a double leg, for example, we're teaching a very specific alignment that takes both feet off the ground. But understanding critically that what causes the falling function, other than a few other things, is the effect we're having over both legs. And so that's what I mean. The double leg doesn't exist. Do you know what I mean? I'm trying to put forth
Yeah, but I disagree, because I tell you what I think. You're right. We want to maybe achieve a certain outcome, let's say throwing a person, right? But I think it's beneficial to say, well, there maybe are a very limited numbers of achieve this kind of goal. And they are like mostly defined by their function, not their form. And I can give you an example. When I think of takedowns, I think they're like tackles, which means basically you move the center of gravity behind the base of support by pushing the base of the center of gravity faster than the base can recover. That's a tackle, right? And you can also think of it as their twist downs, their trips, their lifts, and whatever. And I think these are like literally defined by their function. And a double leg for me, I think a double leg exists because for me a double leg is a double leg is just that, a way to grip the legs to achieve one of these effects.
That's exactly my point.
And that's why I mean the double leg is not a specific thing for me. I would agree that there's no one double leg, but I would say, well, we know that if we have both legs, it's much more likely than that we can achieve one of these 2 or 3 effects. So why wouldn't I call this, like, let's say you talk sometimes, I heard about invariance. Why wouldn't I call a certain place in phase space where everybody always converges to? Why wouldn't I give it a name if it always comes up again and again and again?
This is my point. You're just getting lost in the translation. So the idea is that if the functional outcome is what we're after, and so if we focus solely on the mechanics of the specific alignment, we lose that understanding. We really want to focus on those functional outcomes as the basis for why we do any action. So when we're teaching a double leg, for example, we use your language, we're teaching a tackle. The tackle is driving backwards over the base of support while interacting with both legs with our arms, right? But either way, its functional outcome is the same as, let's say, a hip throw, right? Instead of going backwards with the tackle, we're using a lifting tactic to take people forward over the base of support. So again, it's that functional outcome that we're after. So when we're talking about, quote, techniques, we're really talking about lifting, tackling, blocking, sweeping. We're not talking about double legs. Double legs is a symbol used to define a shared experience. But what is central? What is underneath that shared experience? What do we need to know, actually know, to make sure we understand the nature of what we're talking about? And that's what I'm trying to get after. But so when I say something like double legs doesn't exist, I'm putting forth a philosophical message to change the way we look at the things that are happening in front of us. Let's find out what the thing actually is before we give it just a name.
Yeah, but that's where, like I said, where I disagree, because you say like you look at the functional outcome, right? But I don't think that the resolution you use is the best functional outcome, because like I said, you could say, well, everything where the other person is lying on the floor in a certain way, then it's the same outcome. Yeah, okay, but I don't know how this information really can guide my behavior in any way, because it's too removed from action and it's too removed from effects I can actually produce. But if I can say this is the goal and the outcome I want to achieve is a kind of twist down, a kind of tackle, a kind of this, then I think it's also an outcome, right? It's a causal chain. It's outcome after outcome after outcome. And I don't think that's always best to just look at the most final outcome you achieve, because sometimes it's just better to focus on more immediate effects I want to create in a causal chain.
Yeah. So I think it does the opposite of what you're charging me of. It gives freedom to find a functional degree of effect. So, for example, if we only defined pinning by its aesthetic, so for example, side control, north-south mount, I think we lose the function, because it means like, oh, I have to get to mount, oh, I have to get to side control. No, those things don't exist. You don't have to do anything but hold your partner down to the floor. And the situation you find yourself in is going to dictate the tactics. And though we can parse out these situations and give them hard definitions, they're meaningless outside of their function. So I've been using this experiment with the way I teach is function only, condition and effect. And it's very interesting. The things that we would call steady states or stereotypical alignments emerge on their own relative to the effect the student's able to have. And these things are never discussed in their, quote, mechanical essence. And so that's what I mean. Like, I have students shooting doubles and doubling off from singles when they've never been told to do that. Because, again, their job has only been conditional and effective. There's nothing outside of that in my perspective. But again, after the shared experience, after the interaction, we can use common language to shortcut the focus of intention. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. But that's where I agree. It's like, okay, I agree that if you have no experience, it was that is what I meant when in the beginning, that I don't show techniques to beginners. If you don't have any experience we can share, there's no reason to talk about double legs, right? But once we have these shared experiences, I think it greatly enhances our the way we can communicate, perceive things if we just use appropriate language. And I don't see how a double leg doesn't exist if it points to shared experience we all had.
Just to try to, maybe I'm not being clear enough. When I'm saying it doesn't exist, I'm arguing that, like, for example, let's say we parse out a double leg. Is a double leg only grabbing two legs, or is it done when I'm driving backwards, or is it done when I'm at a 40?
Only grabbing two legs.
Okay, so then any degree of grabbing two legs is a double leg. So when does the double leg start? What if I touch one leg first, and then while interacting with one leg, I switch over to other? Was that a double or was it a single? Is it both?
It was a single to a double.
Right. But why can't it just be a connection to an outcome?
Because I feel like, this is my experience, but maybe you have different experiences, is that this kind of language doesn't really do something for the students because a connection is too abstract. It's like I can connect in 1,000 different ways to the body, and none will achieve the effects I want. But even after, let's say, one session, I can pick somebody off the streets, and like you said, it will emerge naturally that they will do underhooks and, let's say, single legs. Then I can have something to talk with them about, because if I say single leg, it's not something abstract, something just a form. Is, oh yeah, of course, I realized I was always grabbing kind of in a certain way because I wanted to achieve a certain effect, and I don't just don't see the benefit in always being a bit too worried about defining ways, because I agree that form follows function, but in a way, in a sense, form still kind of also constraints function, right?
If it's invariant, correct. And so this is the point I'm trying to make. Again, just let's try to clarify a bit more. The language of analysis and the language of coaching are two different things. So you're confusing my language of analysis with my language of coaching. So when I'm discussing these ideas with people on podcasts or whenever, again, this is just my level of theoretical analysis to try to put forth the idea of condition and effect over position and aesthetic. So when I say that single legs don't exist, that's exactly what I mean. So because we can't define it in the way that they're trying to make the technique define it. So when we say single leg, are we talking about making someone fall down or just grabbing the leg? Is it with one hand or two hands? Is it on the hip, on the knee, on the ankle? What if we switch from double to single? Where is the single leg? So where does the line of analysis stop? And so, yeah, but again, that's what I'm trying to define.
Okay, so yeah, it's just like I said, it's we see it a bit differently, because I feel like I think of it like you said. It's how I think about it theoretically. It's not how I approach coaching or talk with my students. But I see grappling is basically, in the end, I'm a physicist. That's how I try to break down things. I could think of it as two bodies in a certain phase space, right? I could write down the alignment of all joints of my body, and then the relationship of the other body, and then I could imagine this abstract phase space. And then everything moves in the space, and we cannot jump from A to B. Everything has to be steady. Everything has to be, there has to be dynamics. And I think if we would take data of grappling matches, we would see that this phase space is not like filled out completely and completely random, but we will have the certain choke points, certain snapshots, let's say snapshots, that we will see over and over again and again and again along some dimension. And I always felt like that these, like, let's say, attractors or choke points in the phase space, if I know I don't care who will try it, it will come up again and again and again. I think there's great value in giving 100. It a name and talking about it like this.
All right. So again, this is where you probably should have listened to all the stuff that I've said. So we don't have to go down this rabbit hole again. I've explained this out a million times.
We can go also somewhere else. I don't.
No. It's okay. It's okay. Again, if we're talking about a single leg, what are we talking about? It comes up over and over again, because if I want to tackle somebody's legs with my arms, humans only have two legs. I either grab one or I grab both. So the reason you see it emerge is because humans have no other way to grab legs with arms other than one or both.
Yes.
What I'm saying is, so if we're saying single leg, we're just talking about grabbing one leg, fine. And so when I teach an idea, I don't teach a single. I teach how to connect to one leg to produce a myriad of effects. Is an entanglement a single leg, or is it an entanglement? See, because functionally, an entanglement is the same thing when I'm underneath somebody using my legs to destabilize them for some reason, as it is if I'm on my feet using my arms to connect them to destabilize them for some reason. So should we call every interaction with one leg a single leg, or do they all have to have different names? And if they all have different names, what if people talk about them differently? What if one person calls a single leg, the other person calls it the dragon clutch? So what are we actually talking about?
Yeah, but this is where I believe actually judo, or let's say wrestling, is better in terms of language than jiu-jitsu, because like I said, single leg, it's intuitive. It's like you said, whenever I grab one leg, it's a single leg. And I think why there is, like you said, there's only two ways to do it, one leg or both legs. But I think there is a point to differentiate between the two, because the things you can do with one leg are completely different than the things you would do with two legs. So why not also make this distinction?
Well, again, the distinction I make is only down to the invariant. This is why when we talk about grabbing legs, we talk about grabbing one or both. So again, when I talk about the single leg, I'm just talking about grabbing one leg. You know what I mean? I'm not talking, or other two. I'm not talking about single leg as a technique. I'm talking about as an invariant interaction. And so again, so if I'm teaching the idea of making a body fall, and we're teaching the idea of grabbing one leg, that's in fact exactly what we're teaching. So we're teaching how to make and maintain connection for the purpose of manage distance for the purpose of destabilization by attaching to one leg. And so I try to keep the definitions as open so that we can talk about exactly what the thing is, and we can use that exact thing we're talking about to lead directly to its function. And this is actually, judo was actually what inspired this idea for me before I knew anything about invariance, because I thought the Japanese language was interesting because it almost defines what's happening. So when they say, Sasai Sori Komiyashi, they're talking about blocking the advancing step throw. Like, to me, that makes perfect sense. Like, someone steps forward, you block it, continue momentum over the blocked point, person falls down. And the language almost describes it.
Yeah. And this is where I would agree. It's like, but that's my criticism. I think if you say you want to criticize that the idea that there's some technique or certain form, which we call single leg, then I agree 100%. And I think this is the fallacy like people in jiu-jitsu do. But I think no wrestler ever would say that the single leg is a certain form or a certain specific technique or way to do it. A single leg is, like you said, basically a myriad of many complex behaviors which have this invariant, which is I grab a leg, one leg. And I think this is the point. It's like, that's how I always felt the single leg was. I've never felt the single leg is, I don't know, a certain movement or something. Yeah, but if you maybe talk to a BJJ community who is like really obsessed with technique, your criticism makes sense, just never made sense to me.
At connecting form and function, where the jiu-jitsu community is horrifically designed and broken apart and segmented in parts because of the current culture. And that's what I'm trying to combat, because I don't like it. I want it to change. And
that's where I'm 100% on board. I also want to change it.
Yeah, I know.
And I agree with the criticism.
Yeah, I mean, I it's interesting about our conversation, and the reason I wanted to talk to you earlier, and I don't care if we did it public or not, is like I reached out to you right away once I found your page online, because my whole idea was like, I see so many people doing really good, honest work and trying to help this whole thing grow and become more coherent, more cohesive, more serious. And you were one of the first guys that I saw even on social media doing anything like that. There was nothing out there. Like, almost all videos and all content is dead and meaningless. I can barely look at it. And, why I reached out to you is because I was like, oh, this is interesting. This guy clearly has read about the constraints-led approach and the ecological approach and embodied cognition, and has some interesting ideas about how we should make jiu-jitsu culture a little closer to judo or wrestling culture, because, again, they have their ideas are more fleshed out and more well-developed, and we could learn a lot from them. So anyway, either way, like I said, I agree with almost everything. I just think that we really butt heads on the definitions of things. And butt heads is too strong of a word. That's the word I chose.
Yeah. I mean, I see it similarly. I think we agree on many things, and I think the conversation was also good, maybe for you to clarify things, for me to clarify things, and for maybe people to see where we maybe see things similarly or differently. So I think it was worthwhile. Maybe we can do another talk sometime. I think there's lots more we could talk about, but I feel like I let you go to your practice. I mean, I enjoyed the talk, and I think it was really interesting. And again, I'm not opposed to anything you do. I'm just not as committed and convinced maybe as you are.
Yeah. Well, just real quick before we go, I that's one thing I definitely would like to leave with an idea of, because I'd like to hear exactly what you think is being lost. So when you say you're not as committed to the idea, what idea do you think I'm committed to that you're not?
Like I said, I'm not really opposed to the idea of abstract concepts, of using language. I'm more like also focused on observational learning, on understanding, on insight. I find this whole idea, which I'm studying right now, of the aha moment, I find it really fascinating. And for example, for these sudden insights or aha moments, this is something I want to figure out for myself, because I have had these a lot, and they helped me, and I try to bring them about, and I try to understand them, and I just don't see how the practice that is solely, let's say, cybernetic in nature, where you just self-organize and optimize, how you could bring about these sudden insights. I don't see it yet, and maybe you do, but yeah, that's my point of view.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, again, I think I would love to talk more in depth about this subject, maybe in a less time constrained manner, because I think, again, a lot of what I'm saying is being misunderstood. A lot of my positions are being misunderstood because I've been sort of pigeonholed as the ecological guy. Most of my interactions have been trying to argue the basic point of direct perception and people interacting with their environment as being the central and main component for learning. Not that it's the only, but it's the central, and that all the different things that humans can do in a human experience affect this learning, from socioeconomic status to emotions to culture. And so how we manage this as coaches either does our students a service or a disservice. And so again, I think all these things you call aha moments, or these moments of great, change in perception, and when they finally link to an act potential, and we attune finally to the information and coordinate a pattern that we can use consistently in the face of novelty, in the face of variation. I see all these things too. I just believe that they come from interaction with the environment that we're trying to build it in, and almost nothing else. But part of that environment is everything that makes up what a human has a capacity to do, including language, including watching, including mimicry, including inspiration. These are all present. I don't think they're not. So again, I'm not sure exactly what you think I'm saying.
Yeah. Maybe before we end, I can give you not so much a tip. I just think that's just where a lot of confusion comes from. What I always felt, that if you talk about people, when it comes about stuff like psychology, it's unclear where psychology really is. Is it science or is it philosophy, right? Because if you try to talk about direct perception from a scientific perspective, I think this is very, very, very iffy. It's hard. I don't really even know what it would mean. But once you open up the idea of phenomenology, of saying we suspend all this mechanistic, reductionist, scientific stuff, and we just look at how we experience the world as it is experienced as a subject, I think then it's obvious that we have direct perception. I think it's just when we get into these weird discussions, when it's unclear if we're talking about a scientific theory or about the way how to perceive the world, which by definition cannot be understood purely scientifically.
I actually agree with this point. It was interesting how I would start that. Like, how would I like start that in my discussion, because I see that's my disposition naturally. Like when I think of science, I just think of a collection of data, an observational method to try to argue why we're seeing what we're seeing and put into some framework that gives us some type of understanding. And then the exercise of philosophy is just the questions we ask ourselves and how we put it all together. To me, I don't see these things as separable things. Again, maybe one is the human questioning and reaching out, and the other is the method we use to solidify it. I don't know. So, but I think your point there is well taken.
Okay, guys. Well, I have been a pretty enthralled, active passenger on this journey that you guys have been taking, and I think this seems like a good spot to wrap things up. We'll let Greg get back to running his practice. He's got DeAndre Corbe competing in the ADCC next weekend, so I'm sure he's been very busy getting things ready for that. If you'd like to find him, it's GD Souders on Instagram and Standard Jujitsu on Instagram. And Greg, thank you so much for giving us your time today and for everyone to listen to this discussion take place.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate you having me on again. I'm sorry if we didn't get into it deeply enough, and I'm sorry if Andy and I seem to agree more than disagree, and I would love to get into more of the stuff we disagree about to see if there's actually anything there that we could both learn from, especially myself. I would love to have my perspective changed and learn something that I don't feel completely attached to. So again, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and Andy, I think there was more agreement than disagreement, as is normally the way. I mean, everyone's going for the same outcome. So it's School of Grappling on Instagram for you, Andy. And thank you so much again for your time and letting everyone listen in on this conversation.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, and thanks, Greg. I enjoyed the discussion. I think, yes, learning is always, I think by discussing these ideas with someone like you who obviously has done his research, I think I also always learn new things. And I also think that maybe there are more things we can at some point talk about. And I just always want to make sure that people don't get the idea that I think I figured it out, because many of these ideas I'm right now struggling with and I'm trying to understand better. And I'm pretty sure that also Greg has some ideas which, I don't know, maybe can inform me further. And so this was really what I was looking for, and I found it really interesting, and hopefully people listening will find it just as interesting.
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you so much, guys. It's been amazing to listen to, and I'm sure a lot of different people get a lot of different things out of that. So really appreciate your time this morning and hope to do it again in the future.
Yes, sir. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Until next time, you can visit sonnybrown.net to find out more ways to break it down.